Today's tutorial is about EQ and we're going to be covering all the basics for beginners. Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. Now using EQ and using it well is one of the most important skills you'll have in your studio. So today we're going to be guiding you through the basics for beginners. But if you're an old hand, there may be some nuggets of information in there for you as well. We're going to be covering the basics like what kinds of EQs there are, how to basically use them. We're going to be EQing an acoustic guitar and we're going to be taking a sneak look at some of the more advanced techniques you will need to learn in the future. Now, if this is your first time here and you're looking for this kind of content, tutorials about DAWs, home recordings, plugins, etc., then please do subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you get notified about my future videos. Now let's get stuck into some EQing. So let's start off by taking a quick look at the different types of EQ plugins available to you. Now they fall into two basic categories. Those are graphic equalizers and parametric EQs. Now graphic equalizers will look something like this one you can see on the screen here. This is from Nomad Factory and they're easy to spot because they have lots and lots of sliders to control specific frequencies or ranges of frequencies within the audio. Another example of a graphic equalizer would be this one from Waves. Now this one's a little different. There's more sliders to control different frequencies and they have them for the left and the right channel. But what I want you to notice here is the display at the top. This is called a spectrum analyzer and this indicates to you the amount of energy for specific frequencies within the audio, and it's a really useful tool if you're just starting out with your EQing. Now, graphic equalizers are not used as often as something called parametric EQs. These are much more versatile and are more often used in production today. The first examples I'm going to show you are based on some old hardware. This is the SSL EQ from Waves, and this one is also from Waves and it's called the VEQ. Now they are based on the characteristics of those hardware, and sometimes that hardware did sort of color the sound in specific ways and add certain characteristics. So they're not what you call very transparent plugins, and they don't often have a spectrum analyzer. So I don't recommend them if you're just starting out. Instead, I recommend a more transparent one, and a good example would be this one which comes with Studio One, and it's called the Pro EQ. Now this is a stock plugin that comes with Studio One, but if you're using another DAW, you more than likely have a stock plugin that comes with it, which will be something like this. For example, if you're one of my many Cakewalk users, you will have with Cakewalk this one. It's by Sonatus and it's called the Equalizer. This is a 6-band EQ. So what do I mean by different bands? If we go back to the Studio One one here, I can adjust the bands here. This has 7 bands. The bands are basically different control points where you can adjust those frequency or range of frequencies. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind when you're choosing which EQ you will use. Now, if you don't have an EQ like this with your DAW, or you don't like the one that comes with it, there are some free ones available and they're actually quite good. The first one I want to show you is by Melda Production, and this is called M Equalizer. This is a 6-band EQ and is a really nice one to use. And another one which I really like is called Nova, and it's by Tokyo Dawn Records. This is only 4 bands, but it has some extra features with it to adjust the sound, which I think are very, very cool. So you could use this in a combination with another EQ. I definitely recommend downloading this one. So check out the links in the description. Now, in terms of paid equalizers, I really like the one from Isotope called Ozone. I use this quite a bit. It's an 8-band equalizer and it's just really straightforward to use, but very powerful equalizer at the same time. However, the EQ that I'm going to be using in today's tutorial is by FabFilter and it's called the Pro Q3. This is just my favorite EQ to use. First of all, I find it's very versatile. You can add many more than 5, 6, 7, or 8 bands. You can just keep adding bands as you want them, and it has some really very cool features which I won't be covering today, but it's worth taking a look. Now if you're interested in getting this particular plugin, I've got a link in the description where you can actually get 10% off of all FabFilter plugins, in fact, so follow that. However, you do not have to be using this FabFilter Pro Q plugin today for this tutorial, because everything I'll be talking about applies to all parametric EQs that you can get your hands on. So in starting out with EQing, it's good to get some understanding of the ranges of frequencies that we can hear with our ears. Human hearing ranges from around about 20 hertz, which we can see on the left side of this display here, all the way up to 20,000 hertz, which is represented on the right side of the display. Now this particular display actually shows ranges slightly outside of normal human hearing, but your plugin may differ slightly, but they all will show that range of frequencies. Now on the left hand side where the low frequencies are, that's where we'll normally hear things like bass guitars or kick drums as their main frequencies. Let's have a quick listen to a bass. Now you can see that it's occupying these low frequencies down here predominantly, and even these sub-low frequencies right at the bottom here. It's worth noting that these instruments also will fall inside of other ranges. So there's a little bit of this bass guitar which is actually in the low mid frequencies. You can see them here. A good example would be the kick drum as well. If I put the kick drum on, now you can see it's got lots of energy down here in the bass end, but it's got a reasonable amount of energy in the mid and high frequencies as well. But we would generally think of it as a low frequency instrument. Now let's move on to another extreme, which would be something like a hi-hat. Now that exists predominantly up in these high frequencies, which you can see on the right hand side. It still has some in the mid, and even right down on these low frequencies there's still some energy there, but most of it is right up the top there. And we'll also move now onto an acoustic guitar, which covers a much wider range of frequencies. You can see it's predominantly in the mid and upper frequencies, but it still has some down in the low frequencies here. So those are some examples of some instruments and where they exist within that range. And it's good to start thinking about this when you start to listen to different instruments, and think about where their main frequencies are and what other ranges they also occupy. So the primary purpose of your EQ plugin is to cut or boost specific frequency ranges. Now, if I click on this line here in Pro Q3, I can start a new node. Now, as I say, on your particular plugin, there may be some existing nodes or another way to add a new node, but here in Pro Q, we just click on the line, and if I drag it upwards, I can increase that frequency, and if I drag it down, I can decrease that frequency. Now the important thing to notice here is the curve either side. In fact, the frequencies either side of our main frequency that we've selected are also being adjusted according to that curve. Now, if you want to make it much more narrow and be very precise about what you're doing, you adjust something called the Q. It's almost always called the Q in all plugins. Now, if I drag it upwards, it becomes much more narrow, and I'm just adjusting a very narrow range of frequencies there. Likewise, if I drag it down here, I can affect a very, very broad range of frequencies. So that's a very, very important control, and it's important to understand that you're not just adjusting one particular frequency. Now, in this particular example, we're looking at what they call a bell curve, and you can see why it's called a bell curve if I make it like this and you look at the shape. But there are other types of curves that we commonly use. I'm not going to cover all of them today, but I want to cover some of the main ones. The first one I'd like to look at is called a cut. So if I change this curve to a low cut, we can see that this from a particular point starts to cut everything below it. It's called a low cut. It's cutting the low frequencies. Now, in some plugins, it's actually called a high pass rather than a low cut. It's exactly the same thing with different terminology. It's just a different way of saying we'll only let the high frequencies pass, or we will just cut the low frequencies. Now, you can also normally control the rate at which that cut happens. Here it's fairly gradual, but if I wanted to make it more aggressive, I'll just change the control here and change it to 36. You can see this is a very, very aggressive cut. Almost immediately after this particular frequency, which I've chosen, everything below that almost is cut off. Now, if you want to make sure you actually really do cut off literally everything below that frequency, you can choose something called a brick wall. Now, this is not available on all plugins, I have to say, but it's a really good way to show what the cut is doing. So I'm actually going to put this down here, so I'm not cutting much at all, and I'm going to play this acoustic guitar. Now, have a listen to what happens to the acoustic guitar as I start to drag this up. So you can hear what's happening there. It's really just cutting out all frequencies below that point. Now, it has a counterpart in the upper end of the frequency. So for example, we can use a high cut, which is going to cut everything above a particular frequency. Just the same principle in reverse. So those are very useful types of curves. Now, another one that we often use is called a shelf. And I often use a high shelf. I'll just click to shelf here. And what that does is if we look at a particular frequency, it actually increases everything above that frequency or decreases like so. But normally we use it in the sense of a shelf, and we'll look at this a little bit later as we try and add some sparkle to this acoustic guitar. But those are the three different types of curves that you should be aware of, and you can get a lot out of just those three curves. Now, it's sometimes hard to know exactly which frequency that you want to adjust. So I'm just going to create another node here and show you a technique for listening out for which frequency you want to adjust. I just have created a bell curve here, and I'm going to put it up fairly high. I'm going to make it a little bit narrow, just like this. I'm going to play the guitar again, and I'm going to start dragging around this in a very boosted sense and trying to listen to which frequency is being boosted. Here some very high frequencies are being boosted there. The mid ones. So that's called a sweep, and it's a very useful technique for trying to find which frequency you want to adjust. You can then go ahead and adjust that as little or as much as you want to. Now, some plugins actually have a solo feature. This one does, and it's here on this headphone icon here. If I click on that and play the guitar again, it solos those frequencies so I can hear which ones I want to adjust. Now, this isn't available on all plugins, and some of them implement it in a different way, but it's a good one to look out for. Now I'm going to EQ this acoustic guitar using a combination of subtractive and additive EQing. Now, subtractive EQing is simply where you actually reduce particular frequencies, and additive is where you increase particular frequencies. Now, you'll sometimes hear people saying things like, oh, I only use subtractive EQing or additive EQing. I prefer to use a combination of both types of EQing depending on what I'm trying to achieve. So let me explain. I'm going to start off with this acoustic guitar by trying to get rid of some unwanted frequencies, some things that really stand out which I don't like. And often in acoustic guitars, that's a kind of a honky sound in the mid-range, which can make it sound a little bit cheap. So let's have a listen and try and find a couple of those frequencies. Okay, so I'm not really liking that frequency there. So I'm going to reduce down, and I'm going to just narrow that Q a little bit. So I'm just focusing in on a particular frequency. Let's go there, and I'll have a listen again. Now you'll notice I've reduced it there by around about 4 to 5 dB. You can see on the scale here the number of decibels that we are reducing or increasing. Now there's a lot of people who say you should only ever do things subtly, never more than 3 dB, that kind of thing. I really think it's best just to use your ears and take out or add the amount that you want. And sometimes what I like to do is actually just shut my eyes and then do the adjustment, so I'm only using my ears and getting what I want out of the sound. So that's the best tip I can give you in terms of how much. Now I didn't like that frequency, and I think there's some others above it which I didn't like as well, so let's have another listen. Yeah, that area there makes it sound really a little cheap. Okay, so you would go on, I have done a perfect job there, but that's the way you would approach getting rid of particular tones within the whole sound that you really don't like. Now the next kind of subtractive EQing I will do is a low cut. So I'll add in a low cut here. And you'll notice when I actually play the acoustic guitar that there's a fair amount of energy down here, from around about 50 down to 20, that is pretty low and not what you associate necessarily with the acoustic guitar. It's kind of a booming, rumbly sound. So I actually want to get rid of that by using this cut. I'm just going to use my ears again, have a listen. Yeah, I really don't need these frequencies down here, so around about there is fine. Now I'm actually going to change the slope there to really make sure I get rid of some of these sub frequencies, because they can really be undesirable. So I'll make it much sharper. We'll set it at 36. Okay, now I'm really cutting out some of those low frequencies. Now you may ask, Mike, why bother to cut frequencies that you can't really hear anyway? And that's a good question. First of all, when you get several instruments with those frequencies in it, you can get a kind of a build up in that area, and that can create a sort of a rumble in your mix, which you don't want. So that's one reason to get rid of them. And the other reason is, although you can't hear them, your computer, as it were, can hear them, and it will affect other plugins down the chain. So for example, if you're using a compressor on from this EQ, then it may make the compressor kick in when you really don't need it to. So that's another reason to do a low cut, or a high pass, remember, as it may be called by some plugins. So that's all of my subtractive EQing done. The next thing I often do on an acoustic guitar is try and add a little bit of sparkle. And this can happen with vocals as well, for example, where you just want a bit of breathiness in vocals. But in acoustic guitars, I would describe it as a sort of, not quite jangly, but definitely a sparkle at the top. So I'm going to use a high shelf here. So I'll just pop that in there and put in, where is it? A high shelf. And as we discussed earlier, a high shelf is going to increase all frequencies above a particular frequency. So let's have a listen again to this guitar, and I'll just increase that high shelf. Okay, so it's just adding a little bit of sparkle. I could even go further again. Okay, maybe a bit harsh. Okay, so that's by no means a perfect example, but it goes to show you the combination of using subtractive and additive EQing. Now, when you're starting out, it's tempting to think of an EQ as just a fancy kind of tone control to make things sound nice, but that is not quite true, although you can use it for that. But often we use EQ for many different reasons within a mix. Now, I'm not going to go through details of how we use them in different ways, but I just want to give you some inspiration by giving you some examples of how we use EQ. Now, the first one is that we're often using it to kind of carve out a space for an instrument in the mix. Now, what happens is when you've got many instruments in a song and some of them occupy the same frequency range, they actually begin to cancel each other out. And you'll find yourself just pushing up volumes all the time and never quite getting the mix quite right. And that's probably because they collide in frequency ranges. Now, it can be a little difficult when you're starting out to hear which frequencies they're both occupying. So there are some tools that exist to visually help you. So we're looking at Pro Q3 again here, and I've got a track which has both a guitar and an organ which occupies some similar frequency ranges. We're going to start off so you can see the guitar. Now you can see that it occupies this mid and top range mostly here. Now Pro Q has a feature where if I put the Pro Q plugin on both instruments, I can then view them alongside each other. I go to the analyzer down the bottom here and I'm going to select organ here. Now if I play again, you'll see both the guitar and the organ together. And you can see the organ occupies a lot of this space right in the middle here, and they could be cancelling each other out. So if that's happening, we would either decrease or increase frequencies for one of those instruments. So I'm actually going to reduce the middle frequencies for the guitar to try and help the organ shine through a little bit. So let's have a listen. Now finally, I'd like to show you an EQ trick which I use all the time, and you really should use it. This is on reverb. Now in this case, I've got the acoustic guitar and I'm sending it to a really big hall reverb. It's quite overwhelming actually, probably more than I'd normally use, but it's good for this example. Now what happens is when you send something like a guitar to that reverb, you get this real muddy build up in the kind of low and mid end of things. So what I do is put an EQ in the chain before it gets to the reverb. I don't put it on the guitar itself, but I put it on the bus where the reverb is living. So I basically have the guitar, which I have a send to the reverb, and in that chain, I have an EQ on the way. So here's how it sounds without any EQ at all. So as I say, like loads of muddy reverb there, more reverb than I'd normally use. But we can start to really clean it up by adding in a low cut. So I will throw in a low cut here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sliding it up as I play it, and you'll begin to really hear the difference. And so you can hear that's much cleaner. So if you want, you can have that guitar seeming to be in like a cathedral or something without having that horrible low and mid build up. That's a really useful way to use EQ. Now the best way to learn about EQing is to get your hands dirty and start doing it. So make sure you use the best tools at your disposal, and those are your ears. Now if you have any questions at all, please do ask in the comments down below and I'll try my best to answer all of them. If you like this video, then hit the like button. If you didn't like this video, hit the dislike button twice. If you like this kind of content, then do subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you get to hear about my future videos. Now if you've made it this far, then I think that shows a certain dedication to the art of EQing. So let me know in the comments, tell me down below, Mike, I made it to the end, and I will congratulate you there. See you in the next video.